Okay, so this topic is going to try and help you revise the actual fighting in the First World War. And when you do that, you've kind of got to know stuff around the chronology of the war. That's how the battles fought and changed from 1914 through to 1918. You've got to know some stuff around the actual names of people who are fighting, and mostly that means generals, people like Haig for the British, and Ludendorff for the Germans. You've also got to know something around the new technology or different technologies, that of artillery, machine guns, tanks being introduced, gas, airplanes, and finally you've got to know something around the actual economics of the war. That means really how much power the various countries involved had in their industries to actually fight the war, to actually prepare the weapons and make sure that there were enough guns or shells or whatever to fight the war. So there's kind of four topics: the tactics of the war, the technology, the generals, and the economy. And you can kind of get asked questions around things like, why did trench warfare develop? And develop, that means you need to look a bit at the tactics of fighting, and why it was so much more easy to defend with these machine guns and big heavy artillery pieces than it was to actually get out and attack them, and that's why soldiers built the trenches. You're going to get asked about maybe why there was so much loss of life, and I think then again we look at those tactics and the tremendous power of the industrial age, huge force of artillery and machine guns. Maybe then we also want to say, well, what other things was that to do with perhaps poor generalship? Are the generals to blame for constantly sending their soldiers out over the top when all evidence really suggested that this was fruitless and the front line never actually moved? You may also get asked, why did one side win the war, the Allies, and why did the other side lose? What things did they have going for them? And you might turn to look again at the economies there and the strength of the economy of the Allied side compared to the German and Austro-Hungarian side. So a lot of different things going on, but let's take a look first of all at the war and the tactics. So the first thing we need to understand there is that tactics changed during the war, and we can pretty much discern three distinct blocks. Now, the first block, and I just would really urge you to go onto the BBC History website and into their First World War section, and there's a little animation of the whole First World War, which if you watch, it will give you a really good idea of how these tactics developed. So make sure you check that out. But really the first sort of tactics is about open mobile warfare, and this is when the Schlieffen Plan comes in August 1914, and the German army sweep through neutral Belgium, carrying pretty much all before them, and the British forces at Mons and Le Cateau try and stop the Germans as they're going down and down towards Paris. But you've got open warfare, countries out in the open, artillery is trying to protect the British and French retreat, the Germans are firing guns to get them. And this is the first few months of the war. You also have the French offensive into Alsace-Lorraine, the famous Plan 17, which goes dreadfully wrong because the Germans massacre the French attackers with their prepared positions, machine guns and artillery. So this is about open war. And then the Germans run out of steam on the River Marne, which kind of runs east out of Paris. And there are very important battles there, which the Germans actually lose and decide, oh my goodness, the Schlieffen Plan hasn't worked and we've got to withdraw. And it's said the German general then, Moltke, he snatched defeat out of the jaws of victory, so close were the Germans to winning the war. And the Allies couldn't really do anything to push the Germans back further. The Germans dug in on the River Aisne, they withdrew to that, which is kind of about 30, 40 miles north of Paris, really, again running east-west. And the Allies had not much more men, they only had 30,000 shells left, the French. So you then get this sort of open warfare, race to the sea, right up into the north part of France and Belgium, which sort of coalesces around the Battle of Ypres, first Battle of Ypres in the end of 1914, and pretty much neither side has the energy. So all they need to do is just dig trenches, because they have got guns and they are getting shelled with, supplied with shells. So really the safest place is to prepare defensive positions. The Germans haven't broken through. They've got a large amount of land, most of Belgium, a lot of northern France, and the Allies' job is to try and dislodge them. So that's 1914. 1915, you then have this sort of closed trench warfare. 1916, you have closed trench warfare, and 1917, you have closed trench warfare. There are little bits of change around those years. 1915, for the first occasion, you have the use of poison gas around the town of Ypres, where the Germans attack, and that nearly brings the Germans into the town of Ypres, the key strategic town of Ypres, but it doesn't quite. 1916, you have this massive attack of the Germans, starts in February, against the French fortress town of Verdun, try and suck in as many French defenders as they can, and the tactic to bleed France white. That's General von Falkenhayn. Well, Verdun isn't taken, but the front line hardly moves at all, for the costs of hundreds of thousands of casualties dead on both the French and the German sides. Again, we have the Battle of the Somme, which was fought from July to November of 1916. Now here, the British tried to push the Germans right back through, maybe to Berlin. In fact, they only succeeded moving 6 or 7 kilometres forward over months of fighting. So this is what we call trench warfare, static, big bursts of offensive, and then really for the rest of the time not much happening, but the soldiers in their trenches until there are these offensives, big offensives on the front line. Again, the Somme might seem to have been unsuccessful. We'll see later how perhaps during the first bit of the battle, from the 1st of July, when there's all these casualties, the Somme does move and change to being actually quite a learning environment for the British generals, who use different tactics to complete successes in the second part of the Somme battle. But 1917 sees, again, real sort of stalemate in trench warfare. The French attack on the River Aisne in their offensive, in spring offensive that year, really pushed back by the Germans, hardly any gains for hundreds of thousands of casualties, causes mutiny in the French army. And then at the end of 1917, the British attack in the third Battle of Ypres, trying to push the Germans back up the hill. And if you guys have been there on a field trip, you'll know exactly what the terrain's like. But of course, they're unsuccessful in as much as they get the top of the hill. But these few kilometres of gains have hardly moved the front line forward. So that's the trench warfare, the sort of second phase. And the third phase of the war, in terms of tactics, is this remarkable open warfare you get from March of 1918, where the German army brings back all the hundreds of thousands of men from the Eastern Front, where they've signed this, they've defeated Russia, signed this peace treaty with the Russians. They bring back the forces, and their General Ludendorff uses these amazing new tactics to punch holes in the Allied lines, called the Ludendorff Offensive, throughout March, April, May and June of that year. And this is the front line moving, you know, rather than 2 or 3 or 4 kilometres, actually moving, you know, 30, 40, 50 kilometres. The Germans almost break through, but can't quite. The Allies' nerve holds, and then it's the turn of the Allies to go mobile warfare, continually pushing the Germans back and back and back and back. And so this is how the war ends. The Germans can't stand anymore. So 3 phases of tactics in the war. So what do we need to know about technology? Well, I think the first thing is guns and artillery. This is the most important weapon in the First World War, really distinguishes it from all other conflicts. 60%, it's a great stat, 60% of all deaths in the First World War were caused from artillery. And these are really major field guns which can pound the trenches, pound no man's land, make it a very, very difficult, unpleasant place to be, pound the enemy's artillery and make their defence or perhaps attack less successful. Of course, we look at machine guns, and machine guns, as you know from the first day of the Battle of the Somme, really effective. Where you've been to Newfoundland Memorial Park on the field visit, you know that just 3 machine guns caused those thousands of deaths in that very small area. So this was a highly effective defensive weapon. And then it took a while for change to come until the artillery could get more and more accurate. Look at the Battle of the Somme, one example there. The British fired off millions of shells, but a third of them didn't explode. Hardly any of them were used to take out the German artillery. And they really weren't very accurate in breaking up the wire. So that's something that artillery couldn't do. Of course, later in the war, then, guns were far more effective. They could actually use, again, new technology, the airplanes, to spot, and if you had air superiority, you could work out where the enemy's artillery was and direct your big guns to take those out. And of course, less artillery would mean less casualties. This is one reason why tactics were so different at the end, towards the end of the war. So we've got the technology. Of course, the tank is a big thing you need to mention. First used by the British in 1916. Not with that much success. It's a shock weapon, but then again in the battles towards the end of 1918, when the 100 days where the British pushed forward from August, September, October to the final victory in November, the tank is very effective there in breaking holes in the German front line and allowing the infantry to break out. Gas is another technology you ought to sort of mention. We said it already, used in 1915 for the first time. Again, the British used it, the Germans used it. It was a really effective weapon if used in surprise, but all the nations had these gas masks that they had to wear, very unpleasant to fight in. But again, one example of a new technology. Generals next. You need to have some names of generals. Get in your head Moltke, the German general, the start of the Schlieffen Plan, the guy that snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. His nerve sort of failed, and perhaps that's one reason why Germany didn't win the war. So John French, he's the British general commanding the expeditionary force in 1914 and 1915. He was sacked in 1915 at the Battle of Loos. You may remember that's where Rudyard Kipling's son, Jack, who was played by Daniel Radcliffe in the film My Boy Jack, he was killed there. But French was sacked after that because he mishandled the reserves. There weren't enough shells for the British to fight, perhaps an example of incompetence. General Haig is a very controversial figure. There's lots of books on him. I've actually got one book here. Here's a picture of Douglas Haig. Very, very much criticised for his tactics at the Somme, where hundreds of thousands of men were killed for very few sort of kilometres of gain. And Haig is likewise criticised for Passchendaele, particularly for the number of troops that were expended just to get the final bit of the ridge at Passchendaele in 1917 in very, very muddy, wet conditions. So Haig has come in for a lot of criticism. Some people say that Haig actually did a good job. His nerve held, for example, in 1918 when the Ludendorff offensives really punched and pushed Britain back to Amiens, and Haig was very sound in that, and he was also interested in new technology. Some of the German generals mentioned Falkenhayn, the German general in charge of their massive offensive at Verdun. Huge cost of German life and French, but really not much in the way of gain. Falkenhayn is sacked, replaced by Ludendorff, and of course Ludendorff is the man who introduces all these new tactics in 1918 for these tremendous series of offensives that the German army launched. Again, Ludendorff should be seen as somebody bringing new ideas, the use of new light weapons, flamethrowers, shock troops and so on, to the war. But ultimately, of course, Ludendorff fails. And I think we then can bring in General Foch. You need to remember that he was the guy made supreme general, Allied commander, and Foch's appointment is seen often as one of the things that steadied the Allies' nerve. Finally, I would probably put in Rawlinson. Rawlinson is a British general. He was at the Somme. He was Haig's planning general that made the plans that went so badly wrong on the first day. 60,000 casualties in the first day, that's a good figure to remember. Or perhaps if you are going to remember some of the figures, maybe take them from the memorials you've seen. 70,000 missing at the Somme Memorial at Thiepval, 60,000 on the Meningate at Ypres, 30,000 on the Tyne Cotwall. They're good sort of casualty figures, but Rawlinson's a good example because he can be seen to have messed up in the Somme, but it's him really that brings the battles of the 100 Days to fruition. It's his plan at the Battle of Amiens in 1918, which really defeats the Germans, tired out after the Ludendorff offensive. He's learnt from the lessons of the Somme, and the British Army under Rawlinson pushes the Germans back. So again, it's too simple to blame the generals for just pushing on. Was there any alternative? After all, Germany was not voluntarily going to leave northern France, and therefore Haig's argument that the Allies had to push them back with huge cost to life, perhaps that's the one that we have to see. So there's the generals. If we come to the economy, now these are really key figures, and I think for me, you can see how important the war economy is, first of all, in sustaining the First World War. Here's some really great figures for you. Britain was just making 300 machine guns in 1914, just 300. The Germans actually made more. But by 1918, the British were making 120,990 machine guns. That's over 120,000 machine guns in a year. Just imagine an economy that can sustain that. Also factories producing millions of shells. In the first year of the war, there was probably something like 1 million shells fired. Well, when you got to the end of the war, to the battles of 1918, each battle, just by itself, had 1 million shells fired. The weight of artillery is amazing, and of course the economies needed to support that. That really meant you had to have the money and the finance, and this is where really you look at the power of America coming into the war. If you add up the American economy, the British economy, the French economy, and a bit of the Russian, who were in the war up until their exit in 1917, you have the figure total of $40.7 billion. That's really the expenditure on the war, $40.7 billion. Well, if you add up the Central Powers expenditure, that's Germany, Austria-Hungary and Bulgaria, Turkey a little bit, you have $24.7 billion. So that's 40.7 more expenditure for the Allies, Britain and America and France, and 24.7 for the Germans. Now, really, there's no contest between those two figures. Ultimately, if the war went on a long time, then the ones that had the most money to spend were going to win, because they could build more shells, they could build better railways, they could build more ships and supply the weapons and tactics, and that's what's really important. So if you're looking at the fighting on the Western Front, I think all those things considered, get your head round them, a few little dates, and I'm sure you'll be fine.